let's get started. So it's April 20th. We're live. This is our third YouTube live. What did we discuss the first times? We talked about, the first one was about resilience and
Exactly.
doubling down on best practices
Yep.
when
Exactly.
times get tough, like in the coronavirus times. And the second one was on striving for ideals in relationships
And emotions and how
and
emotions are
emotions.
at the peak of the emotion. That's exactly when you're most shaping yourself and most educating the emotions.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Cool. Well, I
what do
forgot
we
that
got for today?
what do we got for today? So we got a
Mhm.
big lineup. So I think based on the questions we got, just trying to organize them into a coherent discussion, I think we can focus on being overwhelmed.
I think a lot of people are overwhelmed these days.
Yeah, because I think going into we've now been in quarantine. I've been hearing from people for 5 weeks, or sorry, not
Wow.
quarantine, self isolate or
Yeah.
shelter in place,
Mitigation. Yeah.
mitigation, caution. So yeah, I think that maybe going in, maybe it was okay. There's going to be less work in many cases. Some people would think that. I was thinking that. Okay, great. But then it turns out
Mhm.
actually there's lots more stuff to do, and
Yep.
so and also I think a key issue is that some of the like kind of distinctions or boundaries between work and life get a little blurred. So then you start to feel everything kind of weighing on you at once.
Hmm.
So that creates a feeling that there's lots of things to do. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get to all of them. And
Yep.
that creates a feeling of being overwhelmed. So I don't know if you have more to add to that kind of
No,
description
there's
of
a
the
question that
problem.
we got
Hmm.
asking, saying that someone said that they're overwhelmed by all the projects they have to do,
Yep.
and that choosing the project,
Do you want me to read
yeah,
the
they get
question?
that's fine, that's okay. I got it. They're
Okay.
fatigued, and in the midst then of their decision paralysis and being overwhelmed, they just go to Netflix and binge.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting set of actions,
Right.
and I wanted to take it apart a little bit because there's two separate things. One
Okay.
is being overwhelmed,
Hmm.
and then the other is not being able to set priorities,
Yeah,
and they tie together. But
for sure.
so when people are overwhelmed, the way I always think of it is that there's it's a question of where is the challenge coming from. So is the challenge coming from outside, like you're being
Hmm.
piled on, it's like just piling on top of you, or does the challenge come from within you? Okay, so in my experience working with people, you're only overwhelmed when you feel the challenge is coming from outside of you. So, like the locus of challenge is external, to put
Hmm.
it in a one phrase. So you're being challenged. Okay, this is what I used to call passive challenge. I can't remember if did you like that term, passive challenge?
Um, yes.
Sometimes you'd push back on that, but we used to talk about being passively challenged.
Yeah.
So you're being challenged instead of actively challenging yourself, and it's a world of difference. You could be overwhelmed um, anytime you've made the judgment this is too much.
Hmm.
So you make the judgment that all these things I have to face is just too much. Yeah, and so once people feel that they're being challenged too much, they make the crucial mistake of trying to flee challenge,
Mm.
challenge reduction. And that's what Netflix is. So a
Mm.
person would turn to Netflix or distract themselves when they're overwhelmed. It
Yeah.
doesn't make any rational sense, right? I have all these things to do, so I'm going to go do
Yeah.
Netflix.
Yeah.
But it does because the challenges are coming from outside of the person, not from inside. And so the response is to try to get rid of challenge, to lessen
Yeah.
challenge.
Yeah.
And then they do these challenge reduction strategies. And
Hmm.
ultimately, that's what every vicious cycle is about. Vicious cycles come when you flee challenges, but then they only increase and you have more
Can
to do.
can you so maybe let me push back on that now. So I think
Hmm.
that's one way of avoiding of like reducing the challenge would be to
Hmm.
kind of go on Netflix just so you don't kind of have to deal with it. So that's a
Yeah.
kind of paralysis. Now,
Yeah.
what would you say about someone who tries to reduce the challenge? Maybe they have a lot of school assignments or work assignments and they say, look, I just can't do all of these things. I'm going to ask a coworker for help, or I'm going to ask my
Hmm.
teacher to extend the deadline on this assignment.
Yeah.
Is
Now,
that a form of challenge reduction?
it depends. I mean, those things could make perfect sense.
Okay.
And certainly asking people for help, the right people for help, can be a great
Hmm.
strategy. Making use of
Hmm.
office hours if you're a student, very
Yep.
crucial strategy.
Yep.
So by no means do we want to say anything that makes it, if it's, the question is, are you engaging the challenge or not? So
Yep.
if you have a problem set to do and you're hitting a brick wall trying to get this done, then to continually, you have to re-strategize. But that re-strategizing of how I'm going to go about doing this difficult thing is engaging the challenge. And
Hmm.
that's the crucial flip. As soon as you find a way to challenge yourself in the midst of the very things that overwhelm you, make you feel,
Yeah.
then you don't feel overwhelmed anymore.
Hmm.
So it's like now you have switched from being passively challenged, which is the overwhelmed state, to now actively challenging yourself.
Hmm.
And the best way of doing it is you take the number one thing that's your top most important thing, your highest priority, you break it down into some steps, and then you really challenge yourself on the very first step. So, an example would be, say, paying taxes, which I think has been delayed now. I hope that's what people tell me. So,
I hope so.
yes, so to July, but it's a very common thing that just thinking of having to prepare taxes could make a person feel overwhelmed. And it's like, oh, there's just so much to do. There's so many steps. And it's like, oh, what do I
Hmm.
do? So instead, to break it down, okay, what are the steps I need to do? The very first step, at least for me, is clean up quicken. So to make
Hmm.
sure everything is there. Okay, so the very first thing would be coming up with my strategy for addressing quicken. And so first I'm gonna open up my report on the last year. I'm gonna see, are there any uncategorized expenses? Then I'm gonna look through my recurring expenses by payee, just to make sure that they're all categorized the same. Or so it's different, but I would set up a strategy and say, I'm gonna do all these steps for cleaning up Quicken in 45 minutes. Okay, my goal is to actually be thorough, to
Hmm.
be systematic, to not miss anything. So just a lot of order and being, and systematic, and then also to do it in a certain amount of time. So just to do a pretty good job cleaning it up in 45 minutes.
Yeah.
As soon as you set a goal, as soon as you make it very concrete, like this is how I'm going to challenge myself in this thing, you don't feel overwhelmed at all, actually. So you feel like now you're getting traction in it.
Hmm.
So it's kind of counterintuitive, I think, that if you're feeling overwhelmed, that the answer is you have to challenge yourself.
Yeah.
I think that's actually what it is. Is that you're not actively challenging yourself, and that's why you feel overwhelmed.
Hmm. Can you, is there a relationship? Because we always talk about reframing mindfulness challenge.
Yeah.
So now your response to being overwhelmed is challenge yourself. Is
Yes.
there a place there also for reframing and mindfulness?
You have to reframe being overwhelmed.
Okay.
And so
How's
if you and so you
wait
try
to
to
your
see that this is exactly, my getting overwhelmed, like my life would improve so much if I was just an expert at getting out of that feeling.
hmm
And this is giving me an opportunity to practice developing that kind of expertise. You just need practice. And so
hmm
whenever you feel overwhelmed is the very moment to practice it. Okay, but what you'll see there is the solution to being overwhelmed. Um, you don't get unoverwhelmed by refraining. That's what's interesting. So you actually get it by actively challenging yourself.
mm
So it's the challenge step that flips you out of ever feeling overwhelmed.
Uh-huh.
But you can reframe being overwhelmed. It's just like distractions don't go away totally just by reframing. You actually have to settle your mind.
hmm
So these are distinct steps. So I think like complaining and dreading is the thing directly reversed by reframing.
Okay.
And then distractions, is the thing directly addressed by mindfulness.
Hmm.
And in some ways, being overwhelmed or lazy, but being overwhelmed especially, is a thing directly addressed by challenge.
Uh-huh.
But they all work together. And so the better you are at reframing and being mindful, the less you'll ever feel overwhelmed. Actually, the way mindfulness helps is the more you can settle your mind into the reality and the present moment, the more you break this illusion that happens when people are really overwhelmed, which is called the illusion of simultaneity, which is the sensation that everything has to be done all at once.
Yep.
There is this feeling like, man, I have so many things to do. It's like they all have to be done simultaneously.
Yep.
And what mindfulness does is it gives you kind of space in your mind and a pause. And then it's like, uh, well, I actually could demonstrate this, but if you imagine, I'll demonstrate this maybe next time.
Okay. We'll,
I need a
we'll get it
prompt.
to, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But it ties in a lot also to schedule. And so, Sharif, one of our most listened to resources has been setting up your day. And I think that actually speaks directly to how you get unoverwhelmed.
Right.
Once you decide to engage the challenges and break them down, then you need to schedule them. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, the schedule has kind of 5 steps. So, I mean, if you think about am I going to engage this challenge as effectively as possible? Well, I have this day to work on being overwhelmed, this day to work on these challenges I'm facing. So I'm going to engage them as effectively as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so the 5 steps, the first is to have a set wake up time. So, and
Hugely important.
this
We get
is
a lot of questions about sleep too.
probably,
We should talk about that.
I talked about,
Not right
well,
now, but
maybe
yeah.
in a future one.
Yeah.
But so the wake up time gets you on track to be engaging the challenge of the day.
Yeah.
So it's how am I seeing the challenge of the day? So jumping out of bed means I'm wanting the challenge of the day. I'm engaging it actively. And
I mean, doesn't laying in bed just kind of make you feel overwhelmed no matter what?
it's like you're hiding.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
if you're just laying in bed, not wanting to face the day. It just seems to me you're setting yourself because that's challenge avoidance.
Right.
I
So
think that's
you're
absolutely
kind of
right.
building that mindset in. And then having a fixed start and end time for the day, for the work day. So you say, I'm going to start working at 9 a.m. and I'm going to stop. So you're putting bounds on the work day.
Mm-hmm.
I think that having an indefinite end time to the work day is kind of giving yourself permission to not be as intensely focused on your work while you're doing it. So, but having the deadline gives you that energy and intensity to really engage each hour of
Absolutely.
work to really make it count. And
Yeah.
then the next thing is to put the fixed things that you definitely have to do at a specific time into your calendar. I use Google Calendar, so I have all my meetings there. If I have a new meeting, I'll put it in at the beginning of the day. If I put lunch in there, so just so I know, because I think part of being overwhelmed is that there's a lack of order. And so it just feels like all of these things have to be, like you were saying, all these things have to be done at once. But then when you put them into your day in specific times, then you're starting to see how this is actually going to work. And then next is to then, okay, now you have a bunch of free spots in your daily schedule where you can then do the work. So you want to structure that into golden hours, about 45 to 90 minutes with a 10-minute break. So that's just kind of a like Tetris or something, a geometry problem, just fitting those golden hours with breaks into the remaining time that you have. And then the last part is to start making progress on the most important things that you have, the highest priority.
And people often ask us, how do you know what's the most important thing?
Yeah. How do you do that? My sense is that you kind of know. I
Exactly.
don't, I
Yeah.
don't really know how to explain it, but like, it's probably the thing that you're
Yeah.
avoiding or dreading sometimes.
Yeah.
But you just kind of have a sense of like, well, these are the kind of things I'm
I've
seeking.
studied different techniques, for your time management, and you take like
Yeah.
Stephen Covey talks about the method of the urgent things, being and the important things, and then you look at how they compare to four quadrants, and then Eisenhower. This comes from Eisenhower actually, but then you have all these different systems, but they
Hmm.
all presuppose that you actually know what's important.
Hmm.
None
Hmm.
of them tell you how to determine what's important. None
Yeah.
of the time
Yeah.
management systems do.
And if you don't know what the most important thing is, then the most important thing is to figure out what the most important thing
Yes, there's probably someone you need to talk to.
is. Yeah.
And that's the most pressing thing then, is
Yeah.
to do that, to
Yeah.
set your priorities for the week with someone.
Yeah.
But I think that's absolutely, and so you can usually also, I mean, people who procrastinate a lot, which is one of those things that can happen when you're overwhelmed, you keep putting things off. That's challenge reduction.
Hmm.
You, I think that then things become urgent, and that's
Hmm.
how people decide what's important, and that's totally the wrong way to do it.
Hmm.
If you keep procrastinating, then yeah, whatever is urgent feels important.
Yeah.
But if something is truly important and truly urgent, well, then that's clearly the thing to do.
Yeah.
But something could be urgent but not really important. You might have to get it done or delegate it, but still, like with order, by scheduling important things in advance. So, like, I don't know. So, like with your system, I think you encourage people, right? That if you know a deadline is coming up,
Hmm.
then you start scheduling golden hours on that project in advance.
Yeah. So you want to estimate, okay, this thing is going to take me 6 golden hours. It's due in 3 days. So,
Yeah,
well, I better get two in each day. Maybe I'll
yeah,
try and even do three on the first day, three the second
yeah.
day. And then that way, the third day, I can see maybe it took a little bit longer than I thought and I can put some more time in.
Exactly. Yep. So you can. So even when I hear you describing that, it's exactly that already. You're engaging the challenge.
Right.
So you flipped it to now you're actively engaging it and challenging yourself there, and you're just by doing that, you're already going to feel less overwhelmed.
Yeah. Well,
But it,
I feel awesome. That's great reassurance for
yeah,
the.
exactly. So you just like change the locus of challenge to inside of yourself.
Hmm.
Challenge yourself in some specific way. Honestly, it doesn't even have to be in the task. You
Uh-huh.
could challenge yourself in a certain form of exercise.
Hmm.
Like I'm going to run the fastest mile, or I'm going to try to do this many sprints. But you can set, as long as you start actively challenging yourself while you're doing that, I think that feeling of being overwhelmed does go away.
Right. And that's actually, I mean, it kind of ties back to the one, two sessions ago. But when you're most overwhelmed, to double down on your best practices.
Yeah.
So I
Because
think
those are
you and I
active
both,
challenges. Yeah,
we're always making sure on if we have an intense day that we're definitely going to exercise that morning.
absolutely. Yeah. And we also like dedicate a certain amount to silence,
Right.
and that never goes away.
Yeah.
And
Non-negotiable.
non-negotiable. And these best practices, once you commit yourself to them and make them non-negotiable, it's like they don't weigh anything.
Hmm.
The cost, the felt cost, just goes away.
Yeah.
If you're debating doing them, they feel like extra things to do, and they can make you feel more overwhelmed. So, but all those best practices, particularly exercise and in times for meditation or silence, um, uh, those best practices actually are ways of challenging yourself. And the more they're just in your schedule and non-negotiable, the more they protect you from ever feeling overwhelmed. Because active challenge is built in. Like if you jump out of bed every morning and you have the habit of doing that, well, then you have a habit of actively challenging yourself from the get-go,
Hmm.
which means then you're protected from feeling overwhelmed that day. And then you just have to use the kind of system Sharif was talking about.
Yeah.
Uh, Real quick, I'd like to touch on some of the questions we got on emotions. We're in our
Okay.
last moments here,
Yeah. We have a
but
minute.
we have a minute left. But so people are asking about um, the someone said, I'm a teacher and a mentor, and I keep hearing the phrase educating the emotions.
Mm.
I don't know if I understand it as it should be understood. If the emotions come from the amygdala, which is in the paleocortex, which can't be reasoned with, then how will we be able to educate our emotions? Okay, and that's a fantastic question. The answer is behavior.
Mm.
You only feel emotions when you're educating them. So the fact that if your behavior is guided by your ideals, that you're trying to ultimately be loving, you're trying to ultimately be helping others, to be understanding, encouraging, and work with order and intensity and all those good things. At times, then you're going to have emotional reactions, and that's actually when you're shaping yourself. I think we'll talk about this more next time. But the idea is, the emotions are only taught by behavior.
Right.
All right.
Okay, so I guess stay tuned for next time where we'll be discussing educating the emotions
And
and
sleep.
the sleep and
We
the
have to talk
illusion
about
of
sleep.
simultaneity, because you need
Oh
to
yeah,
get the
I'll do the
the
demonstration.
prop ready.
I'll do that. Great.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week.
Bye.